I guess with my photography, I'm both dealing with the world out there as it is, and I'm dealing with the language of the medium. So it's both about the world and about itself. So I'm in that space, that delicate space between documentary and more self-referential experimental work. But I use the language of documentary photography, but I'm uncomfortable. I'm always uncomfortable calling myself a documentarian because I'm so aware of how I'm shaping the world, for one, and also I'm not entirely sure. I'm not sure how much I value the role of documentary work the way I once did. I just don't know why the world needs me to document it. I think photography is associated with telling the truth because the hand is not obviously present. If you draw a scene and your hand is connected to that piece of paper and you can feel the artist's hand, then you know they can manipulate the scene. And so this idea that this machine, this box that's a machine, is more truthful because the artist's hand is not there. It's not obviously present. That there's this gap, this black box that's a gap between the world and the photographer that keeps it honest. But this is not true. This is exactly why I'm uncomfortable calling myself a documentary photographer, because I am as aware of anyone that the Mississippi River is a million different things at once. And I mean, I could take you downtown right now and show you luxury condominiums overlooking the Mississippi River. And the Guthrie Theater, one of the country's best theaters, in this beautiful, architectural gem overlooking the river. Did I photograph that in my project? No. The reason is I'm shaping the river. I'm making my own Mississippi. My Mississippi is connected with a sort of faded glory of America, this Twain kind of innocence and a longing for that. And when I photograph a portrait, I'm turning that person into my vision of that person. That is not them. That is that is me looking at them. As a photographer, you're editing the world and thus shaping the world. I mean, the story of Dog Days Bogota is that, my wife and I went to Bogota to adopt a child, and I felt compelled to make work out of this experience. The thing is, I can't photograph my family, and I can't photograph the actual experience of adoption, whatever. So I needed to work by analogy, work by metaphor. And when I was in Bogota, you know, there were all these street children. I couldn't photograph those street kids. It just didn't feel right. And so I used dogs, you know, as a stand-in, as a metaphor. And one thing that I try to do, who knows how successful it is within my own work, every once in a while give a reminder that I am the author, that this is my voice, that I'm connecting these pieces, if that makes sense. And the analogy that I always make to this is The Americans by Robert Frank. And in The Americans, you know, he's showing the world out there, all these little pieces of the world out there. But every once in a while, you have a picture like the view from his hotel window in Butte. And when you see that picture, you have an awareness of Robert Frank, the individual standing there. I have a knowledge of the medium where I can give it some sort of shape. So it's editing, sequencing, constructing a whole. That's the artistry in photography now, as much as going click. It once was the case that, you know, you had to be a scientist to make a picture. You know, you had to mix chemicals and do all that. It was very challenging. But all that stuff is easy now. It's easy to make a picture. It's easy to make a candid photograph. It's all very easy. And that does actually change the medium. Because I think, for me, the only hope for authorship in photography in this insanely photographic age is narrative, is storytelling. That means moving beyond one picture. I mean, so much of photographic history is based on producing this one amazing photograph in isolation. But I think for most people, the only hope is in a series of images that conveys something like a story, where the body of work has a weight. The hope for me is to make a body of work that does have the weight of a story. Inevitably, I'm grasping for tools like text to help me do that. But photographs only work so well with text. So I've started this publishing company called Little Brown Mushroom, which is really devoted to this issue of how can you combine images and text in a meaningful way. I don't believe that photographs have to function 100% on their own. When you go to a movie, the movie has a title. That title shapes the way you see that movie. Many things shape the experience. And as a photographer, I do want to shape the experience both by the photographs, but by the way they're presented in an exhibition, by the way they're presented in a book, etc. And the textual component is part of that. I like the enveloping experience of storytelling, so I long for that. But photography is not very good at that. And it functions in this more fragmentary way. So for that reason, I look at poetry as an analogy. I always work towards the book first. It's in every case. This is the way I think. And I'm trying to construct this beginning, middle, and end in this sequence of images. So I've been doing this project with this writer for the last year, and it's based on newspaper photography. And so this writer and I are going out on these stories, and sometimes on these road trips now, and we're actually publishing a newspaper. And so I think of these things in this newspaper format sequentially as we make them, very quick editing. But I also, you know, have my eye on a long-term vision, what's going to happen with this work in the future. It's both a look at sequencing as well as size relationships, and sort of, I can look at this image right here, and that's the print that's on the wall in the next room, and I can sort of do an imaginary scale version where I'm imagining the gallery space. This is an example of how it can work on the wall. This is just a test print, just to give a sense of scale. I mean, that's the thing, is that, you know, photographs can exist in very different ways, and it can exist online as this tiny little JPEG, and it exists in the book as one thing, and then often with the cameras that I work with, you know, I can enlarge these images greatly, and they can have this other kind of power. And this is a particular image that I love in isolation from other pictures, where it just is you know, it's almost like an action painting. Film parties, they don't exist so much anymore. When I was in my mid-20s, I didn't go to them, but it was like suburban bars would do this as a way to attract people. So this, on a recent trip to upstate New York, this was going on. And it's, I mean, it's a really funny picture to me. And one of the things that's really revealed in the large print are some of these details. I mean, the fact that her tattoo really works with the pattern of her dress in a beautiful way that would be hard to see in a small image. And then kind of most importantly, these shoes, and they're clearly like a new pair of shoes with the size sticker right there. These tiny little details that emerge. So that's the thing about photographic narrative, is that it's more often than not, you don't tell a story, you suggest a story, and then the viewer fills it in. So a lot of my work is produced with a large camera, and with that camera and the way it works, outdoors I don't need to light things, but very often indoors I wouldn't have enough light, so I would need to light. As time went by, for whatever reason, I disliked the look of lighting and wanted a more naturalistic feeling, and so I used less and less of it. But that partly forced me more outdoors, just because I just couldn't handle the long exposures inside. And nowadays I'm in a very different state of mind, and not only am I lighting, but I'm using very hard flash, and so I'm just pounding the scene with light, very artificial light, and I'm interested in that phenomenon. So it really varies. I mean, one thing technically about my approach is that I really want to be almost like, in this sense, almost like a film director, in that, okay, for this film, I'm going to use this kind of camera, this kind of lighting, and not be identified by one look, one camera. In the last, 3-4 years, I've been battling with the medium, and I wanted to sort of take apart my photography and build it up again. And in this dismantling process, I found it interesting to strip it of color and see what happens. And for me, it was a real sort of rewiring of my eye to not look at the world in color. It is entirely different. But somehow, I still feel like the tone does feel like my own, somehow. When I look at a black and white photograph, my brain goes more into a photographic space than into real world space often. And there's something interesting in that. I mean, one really interesting phenomenon right now that's just happening at this moment in photography is this Instagram phenomenon of making digital photographs look like old photographs. And that's a fascinating concept as well, of overlaying nostalgia into something that's new. And I think there is something about my use of black and white. In a way, you could say that black and white takes you, it's like it moves you more into the poetic sphere than the novelistic sphere. And in a way, with black and white, and also other forms of manipulating the image, you're being less realistic, and thus you're seeing the whole in certain ways of the medium. You're wrestling with the medium as well as with the real world. I'm just not sure how much I predetermine things at all. I mean, I have ideas of what I'm after, but they change greatly over time. So in a few days, I go to Michigan to photograph, you know, on a road trip through Michigan. And I have a notion of, you know, this murky notion of what I'm looking for. But I know, I mean, the whole art of the thing is leaving it open to change gears as you're moving through the space. I have a great deal of affection for the middle of America, and it's the big middle of America. It's a huge swath of territory, and it's my sort of mission is to show that it's full of nuances and it's full of variations that are incredibly interesting. And it's not all one thing either. And I can read those variations in a way that is probably harder for, you know, someone outside the U.S. But I have an affection for it. The reason I photograph people is it is a form of attraction. And what attracts me to people is a mysterious blend of, you know, my own personal history, my parents, you know, like this, you know, all the things that affect you, where you grew up, certain types of people, and I can't put a word on it, but I sort of know it when I see it. I like being sort of attracted and pulled into a character. And so that's the deal, is I drive around and I pass 100 people on the street, and then one of them has that thing. And when I see that thing, then I turn into this other person. I turn into a salesman, and I have to go sell them on the idea of being photographed. And this is the kind of ugly part of what I do, is talking people into this, because it's full of sort of ethical problems that are unresolvable. I believe in photographing what's close to you. Like, I really wish that I could photograph my life, my ordinary life, living in this ordinary place. But I can't do it. It doesn't work for me. I've tried many times. So if I photograph my wife, and I put that picture on the wall, I can't imagine who she is. I can't read into the surfaces. I know. I know the inside of her brain. I know her history. I know everything. And so I can't just look at the surface of the picture in that same sort of way. And so it just doesn't work for me. Sometimes people say, you really get to know the people, you spend all this time making them feel comfortable, and that's not true. I don't chat that much with people. I mean, and I jokingly say my ideal portrait session is I approach someone, you know, I hand them a sheet of paper, and we never talk. That I can just look at them and study them and take them in. Let me say this. When I started as a photographer, I was incredibly shy, okay? And I was terrified of photographing people. And it's a large part of the reason I'm a photographer was this fear and overcoming it. But one of the things about the technical process of making these pictures is I would use a large camera, and the speed of that, the slowness of that, would just naturally allow for time for the subject to relax. And that's what I was going for, was a state of relaxation, a state of not being agitated in front of the camera, but just being present, and just the person in this deflated, relaxed state. But that does not resolve the ethical issues surrounding it, because I'm still so aware of how I'm constructing the picture by virtue of who I choose to photograph, where I choose to photograph them. Even if they give me 100% permission, I'm still shaping how they look to the world, and I'm aware of that. So I never felt purified, you know, by the fact that I asked permission. I mean, my approach generally with subject matters, the subjects of the photographs, is to be honest about what I'm doing and to tell them. You know, so in the case of Niagara, I would say, I'm doing this project in Niagara Falls that's about love, and it's about a certain kind of longing. And I will say things like, I think there's nothing more beautiful, and this is true, I think there's nothing more beautiful than vulnerability. I think a model caked with makeup is a shallow beauty. And I think the beauty of someone you love crying and showing their vulnerability is 1,000 times more beautiful. And I found that when I'm more honest about what I'm really trying to achieve, people respond to that. They believe it. Some men want to photograph, you know, beautiful women on the beach. It's like same thing. I'm attracted to loners. My goal is not to humanize them or to make a commentary about them. I'm trying to make something beautiful. That's where I always think the picture is not of the person, it's of the relationship between myself and the person. And for the viewer, ideally, the picture's about their relationship to them. And we all have this experience all day long. You know, you're on a subway and the person's sitting there and you're looking at them and you're kind of figuring out what their background is, if they're married, do they have kids. You're analyzing this. You're putting it within the frame of the artistic environment. You get to sort of step back and look at that exchange. When I did Sleeping by the Mississippi, I worked alone, and as well as Niagara, and it was an essential part of my work was being alone. But the thing that was quite different at that time was that I worked a regular job. I had this, a pretty dull life, where it was just like working 9 to 5, not much freedom. So the idea of hitting the road and exploring was so romantic to me. Now in my life I travel more than I don't. I'm always traveling. And travel is not really romantic in the same way. And so the meaning of it has changed. And to a certain extent I've lost the innocence that I had then. Broken Manual is a book, which is a manual on how to run away from your life, and it's a photographic manual, but there's also text component. And as part of the project, for a long time, I was looking for a cave to run away in, and I was photographing caves, and I had this dream of a cave with a treehouse on top of it. I think what I keep coming back to is this fantasy mashing up against reality, and with photography, you are confronted over and over again with the world as it is. I have a brain with a dream state, but I'm moving out in the world as it is, and I'm trying to put those two things together at times. And with this project, I was looking for this fantasy cave. It was a total dream cave, and it doesn't really exist in reality, and what would I do with it if it did? I don't need it, in a way. But I think photography is part of the machinery of dreams. Without being corny and sentimental, the reason I'm a photographer is because I was a lonely kid, and I liked being alone. But what's funny is how things have changed over time, and now I find myself always collaborating and always having other people in the car with me. So there is a weird dynamic where it's about a yearning for loneliness, a romantic kind of yearning for it, as well as a fear of it. To be honest, I don't think of photography as an escape anymore. it's morphed into something else. You know, I have a larger awareness of what I'm doing. When I did Sleeping by the Mississippi, I had no idea what I was doing. I mean, I was just, you know, I was clueless. And I just have a better sense of it. But that's not a bad thing. It's just different. Photography is largely an excuse to wander. I said that, you know, the great achievement in photography is storytelling, is narrative, is all of this stuff. So the natural question is, why am I not a filmmaker? The reason is that photography is a lot more fun. With photography, there is this freedom to wander and to just poke around and have a look at things, and not necessarily to have an explanation for everything that you're doing. The question is, how do I justify that? How do I make something of that that's worthy for other people to look at? That's the problem.